Why did no one ever wonder what she carried behind those calm green eyes? Morning crept over the mountains like a slow exhale, pale light spilling across the jagged Afghan ridges and pooling in the valley where forward operating base Viper crouched among stone and dust. Diesel fumes clung to the cold air, mixing with the metallic tang of gun oil and the faint scent of coffee that leaked from the mess tent. Inside the wire, soldiers moved with the practiced rhythm of people who had repeated the same motions for months. Weapons checks, perimeter sweeps, the quiet shuffle of boots across gravel. Tessa Brooks moved among them like a shadow with a purpose. 26 years old, green eyes steady and unreadable, she carried a clipboard in one hand and a battered canvas medic's bag in the other. "Morning, Doc," someone called as she passed the motor pool. She offered the smallest of nods, a flicker of a smile. The men called her Doc with the casual affection of soldiers who trusted her to keep them alive. None of them ever wondered why her movements were so deliberate, why she could thread through the chaos of a base at dawn, as if she'd mapped every step in advance. Inside the medical bay, fluorescent lights hummed above stainless steel counters. Tessa hung her bag on a hook and began the ritual she performed every day, inventorying bandages, checking morphine levels, calibrating monitors. Her fingers worked with quiet precision, a surgeon's grace hidden beneath army fatigues. She liked the order of it, the click of vials against metal, the measured notes in her logbook. Out here, where everything could shatter in a heartbeat, order was a fragile comfort. A photo of a girl with a birthday cake, Sergeant Williams's daughter, was tacked to the cabinet. Tessa let her gaze rest on it for a moment. Soldiers clung to pictures like lifelines. She carried no photos of her own, not anymore. The radio crackled to life at 6:30. All quiet on the perimeter. Supply convoy scheduled for 1400. Weather clear, light winds northwest. Routine. Safe. The kind of report that should have eased the knot of vigilance that lived at the base of Tessa's skull. It didn't. She logged the message anyway, her handwriting small and even. By 800 the soldiers gathered in the briefing tent. Captain James Morrison stood at the front, a tall man with weathered skin and the easy authority of someone who listened as much as he commanded. "Intelligence indicates increased hostile activity in the region," he said, eyes scanning the room. "Nothing specific, but we're upgrading to condition yellow. Stay sharp." Tessa watched him closely. Morrison was usually relaxed, joking with his troops to keep the edges of fear dull. Today a tension hid in the corners of his voice, like he was hearing something the rest of them couldn't. She felt it too, a faint current under the morning calm, but she said nothing. Secrets were safer that way. After the briefing, she made her rounds. Sergeant Williams lay on a cot recovering from shrapnel wounds. He beamed as he showed her a new photo of his little girl, frosting on her nose. "1 year old already," he said proudly. Private Carson sat propped against a pillow, cheeks pale from altitude sickness, spinning a story about the fishing boat he planned to buy when his tour ended. Corporal Martinez, stubborn as ever, argued that a proposal by video call was still romantic if you meant it. Tessa listened, smiled, adjusted IV drips. These were the moments she cherished, not the adrenaline of emergency surgeries but the quiet connections, the fragile reminder of why they were all here. Yet beneath her calm, another layer stirred, a part of her mind counting heartbeats, measuring distance to the door, mapping exits. A habit she'd never unlearned. When the ward was settled, she moved to the supply shelves, checking instruments with an almost meditative focus. Her hands knew the weight of each tool, the exact resistance of every dial. Once, those same hands had known the weight of something else entirely, steel and composite, the cool balance of a rifle against her shoulder. She pushed the memory back, but it slipped through anyway. Early mornings on a different range, the scent of oiled metal, a voice in her ear whispering steady breath, let the world narrow to a single point. She had buried that life 8 years ago, or tried to. Have you ever carried a secret so heavy it feels like armor? Sometimes the very thing that protects you keeps you from everyone else. Outside, the mountains basked in a deceptive sunlight. Wind chased dust across the landing pad, rattling the chain-link fence. Tessa paused at the doorway, drawn by the vast silence of the valley. Her breath misted faintly. Somewhere beyond those ridges, unseen eyes might already be watching. She felt it like a pressure at the base of her neck. The morning slid toward noon. Soldiers cleaned rifles, traded jokes, drifted between boredom and anticipation, the strange rhythm of a remote outpost. Tessa sterilized instruments, her mind drifting despite herself. Childhood mornings flickered back, not cartoons and bicycles, but a father teaching her to read the wind, to listen to the world until it spoke in patterns. "The rifle doesn't make you dangerous," he'd said. "Your mind does. The rifle just extends it." She could almost hear his voice, as clearly as the buzz of the fluorescent lights. She set the memory down like a fragile glass. That life was over. She was here to heal, to choose compassion over conflict. That was the promise she'd made. At 11:47, the valley shattered. A thunderous crack rolled through the mountains, shaking dust from the ceiling. Tessa flinched as the floor trembled beneath her boots. Before the echo faded, a second blast followed, closer, sharper. Then came the rattle of automatic gunfire from 3 directions at once, a brutal chorus that drowned the hum of the lights. Her body reacted before thought. Field kit slung over her shoulder. Sidearm checked. She was moving, heart steady, breath controlled, the training of a medic taking command. Yet another current ran beneath it, a deeper instinct she had long denied, something older than her years of medical school, older than the uniform she wore now. Outside, chaos erupted. Sirens wailed. Soldiers sprinted to defensive positions, shouting over the staccato crack of incoming rounds. The smell of smoke and cordite clawed at the air. Tessa ducked behind a barrier as a mortar shell slammed into the far perimeter, the blast sending a rain of gravel across the compound. "Condition red," a voice bellowed over the loudspeaker. "This is not a drill." She scanned the horizon. Muzzle flashes winked from the ridgelines, scattered like malicious stars. The attackers had chosen their positions well, high ground, overlapping fields of fire, the element of surprise, classic siege tactics. Tessa's heart beat once, twice, slow and deliberate. She recognized the pattern, the angles. Her medical training had no chapter for this, but something older inside her did. "Doc," Sergeant Kim stumbled toward her, blood soaking his sleeve. She caught him by the vest and dragged him behind cover, fingers already working. Tourniquet, pressure dressing, morphine. He hissed through his teeth but managed a grim smile. "Never a dull moment, huh?" Another explosion shook the ground. Radio chatter blurred into a frantic rhythm. Reports of wounded. Perimeter breached in places. Enemy strength unknown but heavy. Tessa's mind mapped it as if she'd trained for this, and she had, though not in any way these men knew. She moved again, a phantom through smoke and dust, pulling the injured to safety, stabilizing wounds with swift efficiency. Every step carried the echo of another life, the awareness of sightlines, the instinct to gauge distance to the next cover. She hated how natural it felt. By the time she reached the eastern trench, the air burned with cordite and grit. 3 soldiers crouched behind a low concrete barrier, rifles spitting short bursts. Rodriguez, leg wound, bleeding fast. Jensen, shrapnel across the back. Young Williams, head wound, dazed but firing. They were nearly out of ammunition, the enemy pressing from above like a tightening noose. Tessa dropped beside them, medical kit already open. "Hold still," she ordered, voice firm despite the storm around them. Rodriguez groaned as she cinched a bandage around his thigh. "We can't hold much longer," Jensen shouted over the gunfire. "We're down to scraps." Rodriguez jerked his chin toward a corner of the trench where a weapon rested, untouched. An HK-416, scope glinting faintly through the dust, 2 full magazines waiting. For a heartbeat she stared at it, the world narrowing to the familiar silhouette. 8 years collapsed into nothing. Breath slowed. The old lessons whispered back, insistent and unyielding. Have you ever felt the moment when everything you believe about yourself starts to fracture? The medic, the healer, Was that still who she was? Or had it only ever been half the truth? Bullets whined off the concrete, spraying chips of stone. She reached for the rifle. Rodriguez blinked through the dust, eyes wide. "Doc, you know how to use that thing?" The question barely registered. Tessa's fingers closed around the rifle as though it had been waiting for her all along. The metal was warm from the Afghan sun, the balance precise, alive. Memory slid into muscle. She eased into a low crouch, the world shrinking to a calm she hadn't felt in 8 years. "Yeah," she said quietly, almost to herself. "I know." Her breath slowed. One heartbeat, two. Through the scope, the chaos of the ridge sharpened into ordered fragments, a flash of muzzle here, a shadow shifting there. 8 enemy fighters in view, more hidden in the rocks. The leader barked orders, his gestures crisp, confident. She read the wind with a glance, adjusted half a click. The first shot was a soft exhale. The man dropped mid-command, his voice silenced before it reached the air. "Holy," Williams started, but another crack of her rifle cut him off. A second hostile fell, the RPG launcher tumbling from lifeless hands. She didn't wait to watch it land. Third shot, flanker to the north, crumpled against a tree. Fourth, another RPG operator, gone before he could aim. "Cover fire," she said, the words even unhurried. "Short bursts, keep them down." Jensen and Williams obeyed without thinking, squeezing controlled rounds that forced the remaining fighters to hug the rocks. Tessa moved like a metronome of intent, breath, sight, picture, squeeze. The rifle kicked lightly against her shoulder, familiar as a pulse. 5, 6. By the time the magazine clicked empty, the enemy advance had stalled, their formation broken, the ridge suddenly still. Silence settled, eerie and immediate. Only the echo of their own gunfire answered back. Rodriguez stared at her, pain forgotten for a moment. "Where in God's name did you learn to shoot like that?" Tessa swapped magazines, eyes never leaving the ridge. "Different life," she said. "Keep your heads down." For several long minutes nothing moved. Then, as if on some silent signal, the remaining attackers began a ragged retreat, slipping back through the rocks toward the high passes. The siege wasn't over. Sporadic gunfire still rattled across other sectors, but the eastern flank, the key to the base, was suddenly clear. Captain Morrison's voice cracked through the radio. "Eastern position, report." Tessa pressed the mic to her lips, steady. "Doc Brooks, position secure, enemy leadership eliminated, hostiles withdrawing." A beat of stunned silence. "Say again." "You heard me," she replied, eyes still on the ridge. "Eastern approach clear." Another pause, then a low, measured answer. "Outstanding work, Doc. Hold position. Reinforcements en route." She lowered the rifle, shoulders tight with a strange mixture of relief and dread. Around her, the wounded soldiers exchanged glances, respect, disbelief, something deeper they couldn't name. Williams finally broke the quiet. "Guess we've been underestimating you." Tessa said nothing. The part of her that usually offered a reassuring smile felt distant, unreachable. The air smelled of hot stone and cordite. She checked Rodriguez's bandage again, more to anchor herself than out of necessity. When backup arrived, 2 squads moving like ghosts through the smoke, the fight across the rest of the base had begun to turn. With the eastern pressure gone, defenders were free to regroup, to counterattack. Mortars fell silent. By 1500, the last hostile shots faded into the mountain wind. Fob Viper still stood. Night dropped fast, a blanket of black velvet over the valley. The mountains swallowed the last echoes of combat. Inside the dim medical bay, fluorescent lights buzzed like tired insects. Tessa scrubbed blood from her hands, the water running pink into the drain. Her reflection in the steel sink startled her. Eyes too bright, jaw set, a flicker of something she hadn't seen in years. Not fear, not exactly pride either. Something older. The HK-416 lay on the counter, cleaned and oiled, every piece of it gleaming under the harsh light. She hadn't let anyone else touch it. Each swipe of the cloth had felt like a conversation with a part of herself she thought she'd buried. Captain Morrison entered quietly, closing the door behind him. His uniform smelled of smoke and dust. He carried a thin folder under one arm. "Doc Brooks," he said, voice low but steady. "We need to talk." Tessa straightened, drying her hands on a towel. "Yes, sir." He set the folder on the table and took a seat. "According to multiple witnesses, you neutralized at least 6 hostiles. 8 rounds fired, ranges between 280 and 390 meters. Iron sights." He paused, studying her face. "That's the finest marksmanship I've seen in 15 years of service. And you're a medic." She held his gaze calm. "Before the medical corps, I had different training." "What kind of training?" His tone was more curious than accusatory. "The kind that teaches you the wind's language," she said softly, "and when not to pull the trigger." Morrison leaned back, eyes narrowing in thought. "Why keep that hidden? Skills like that, we could have used them." "With respect, sir, I joined to save lives, not take them," she answered. "I made a promise to myself 8 years ago." He nodded slowly, as if weighing invisible scales. "Today you saved 43 lives, including mine." The words hung between them, heavy and undeniable. Hours later, long after the captain left, Tessa sat alone in her quarters. The base outside was a fragile hush, broken only by the occasional murmur of patrols. She pulled a worn photograph from the bottom of her pack. A younger version of herself stared back, 18, hair tucked under a different uniform, a rifle slung across her chest, eyes fierce and untested. Around her, faces she'd tried to forget. A past she had once believed she could outrun. She traced a finger over the image. "I promised I heal, not harm." But promises, she realized, could evolve. Tonight those 2 vows, one to save, one to never kill, had collided and fused into something she didn't yet have words for. She found a notebook, pages yellowed and soft, and began to write. Not a report, those would come later, but a letter she'd never send. "I used the training today," she wrote. "Not for the reasons it was given to me, but for the reasons I chose when I became a medic. I kept my promise to save lives. I had to break the one about never taking them again. Maybe that isn't a contradiction. Maybe sometimes healing means stopping the people who would destroy what you protect." She paused, listening to the low hum of generators outside, the whisper of wind over the wire. Somewhere in the darkness lay men who would never come home. She felt no triumph in that, only the cold weight of necessity. Morning brought a sky scrubbed clean, impossibly blue, as though the valley itself had decided to forget. Soldiers moved through the base with a quieter kind of respect. They greeted her the same morning. Their eyes lingered, curious, measuring. Rumors traveled faster than supply convoys. Everyone knew who had steadied the eastern line. Rodriguez found her near the mess tent, hobbling on a crutch. "Couldn't leave without saying thanks," he said, grin tight with pain. "You saved our hides." Tessa offered a small smile. "You did your part." "Not like you did." His gaze softened. "Wherever you learned that, I'm glad you were here." She nodded, unsure how to answer. Gratitude felt heavy when paired with the memory of the shots. A chopper thundered overhead, dropping low enough to scatter dust across the compound. Supply convoy, finally on schedule, hours too late to matter. By afternoon, a sealed envelope arrived in the medical bay, marked confidential. Orders for transfer. Special Operations Medical Unit. Promotion to Staff Sergeant. Effective immediately. She stared at the paper, the words blurring for a moment. Someone high above had read the after-action report. Someone had decided her hidden skills were too valuable to leave on a quiet mountain base. That night, as the sun bled out behind the peaks, she walked the perimeter alone. The mountains glowed red, then purple, then black. She could almost feel the eyes of her past watching from the ridges, waiting. When the helicopter came for her 3 days later, nearly the whole unit gathered on the landing pad. Dust whipped around them, stinging eyes, catching on uniforms. Rodriguez shook her hand with his good arm. "Wherever you're going, they're lucky to have you." Jensen managed a lopsided grin. "Take care of yourself, Angel. Don't forget us when you're famous." Captain Morrison stepped forward last, handing her a small wooden box. Inside lay a commendation medal and a handwritten note, for someone who chose to be more than she thought she could be. He met her eyes. "Your skills saved 43 lives, Doc. That's what matters." Tessa felt the thrum of the helicopter behind her, the pull of a future she hadn't asked for but couldn't refuse. She closed the box and offered a quiet nod. "Thank you, sir." As the rotors roared and the ground fell away, Fob Viper shrank to a patch of gray amid endless stone. The battle was already fading into rumor, but something inside her had shifted forever. She wasn't just a medic anymore. She wasn't just a soldier. She was something in between, a healer who could fight, a fighter who chose to heal. The mountains rolled beneath the chopper, silent and unjudging. Tessa looked out at the horizon, the photograph of her younger self tucked deep in her pack, and wondered what new promises she would have to make, and which ones she might have to break. Why did the helicopter's rhythm sound less like flight, and more like a question she couldn't answer? Each thump of the rotors seemed to echo a single word: why? Why accept the transfer? Why step back into a world she'd once sworn off? The mountains fell away beneath the Black Hawk, their jagged ridges fading into endless brown and silver. Tessa sat strapped beside the door gunner, headset crackling with static. Wind whipped through the open frame, tugging at her thoughts. She had faced death on that ridge, but this quiet stretch of sky, felt more uncertain. Opposite her, a young crew chief studied her in quick glances, curiosity hidden behind mirrored lenses. Maybe he'd heard the rumors, the medic who stopped an entire assault with a handful of shots. He didn't ask. Soldiers learn fast which questions belong to silence. Tessa closed her eyes. Behind her lids, the battlefield replayed in flashes, muzzle flares like lightning, the weight of the HK-416 settling into her hands as if it had never left. But the memory that held her wasn't the kill shots. It was the stillness afterward, the breath she released when the ridge went quiet. A calm too sharp to name. Healing means stopping harm. She repeated it like a mantra, unsure whether it was comfort or confession. Hours later, the helicopter touched down on a barren tarmac fringed with hangars. Night had already swallowed the horizon. No insignia marked the base, only anonymous structures and the faint chemical tang of jet fuel. A single figure waited at the edge of the landing lights, hands clasped behind his back. "Staff Sergeant Brooks," he greeted, voice crisp enough to cut through rotor wash. "Welcome to Forward Staging Site Raven." The man was tall, mid-50s, uniform unadorned except for the faintest outline of a colonel's rank. His presence carried the weight of quiet authority. "Colonel Marcus Steele," he introduced himself as they walked toward a waiting jeep. "You've read your orders." "Yes, sir," Tessa replied, matching his stride. She had read them again and again during the flight, but the words were careful shadows: special operations medical attachment, assignment classified, duties to be determined. Steele offered a small, knowing smile. "Good. You'll find details are scarce until you need them. Operational security." The jeep bounced along a dirt road toward a low compound lit only by muted red lamps. "I read the report from Viper," Steele said after a moment. 8 rounds, 6 confirmed. That's more than skill, that's control." Tessa kept her gaze forward. "I was there to save lives." "And you did, but you also prevented far greater loss. That duality interests us." His tone was observational, not congratulatory. "We work in places where the line between medic and operator doesn't exist. I need people who can cross it without hesitation." "I became a medic so I wouldn't have to." He interrupted gently. "And yet when it mattered, you did. That tells me more about your character than any resume." They stopped outside a reinforced door guarded by 2 silent MPs. Steele keyed in a code. "This unit doesn't exist on paper. We're called the Spectre program. Small teams inserted into regions where conventional forces can't go, deniable, surgical. We keep operators alive in the worst environments imaginable, but we also neutralize threats when necessary. The door swung open, revealing a briefing room bathed in low blue light. A map of the world glowed across the far wall, dotted with points of dim red. Screens flickered with data streams Tessa didn't recognize. The air smelled faintly of ozone and machine oil. Steele faced her. You'd be embedded as primary medical specialist, but you'll train and operate as a hybrid, healer and protector. We call it dual-role capability. Few can handle the psychological load. I believe you can. Tessa felt the weight of his words settle like sand. Why me? Because you made a promise to save lives and kept it, he said quietly. And because you know when saving requires other actions. That's rarer than you think. He handed her a slim folder, its pages stamped top secret. Inside, a mission profile, half redacted, outlined a potential deployment in a coastal region she'd only ever seen on maps. Insurgent cells, civilian risk, hostages. We start training at 0600, Steele said. Gear issue is down the hall, get some rest. Her quarters were spare, a narrow bunk, a metal locker, a single desk lamp glowing like a lighthouse in the dark. She set her medic's pack on the floor, then hesitated before unzipping it. The photograph of her younger self slid out, edges worn soft. 18-year-old Tessa stared back with a defiance that felt both foreign and familiar. She remembered that girl's first real lesson. Not the marksmanship, the mindset. Control the moment, or the moment controls you. She had thought leaving that world meant leaving the lesson behind. But the truth had followed her to Viper and found her on a smoke-choked ridge. She sat on the bunk, the hum of distant generators the only sound. What was she becoming? Not a sniper again, not just a medic, something unnamed suspended between. Sleep came in fragments. Dreams of mountains and echoing gunfire gave way to dawn's pale light. Training began before sunrise. The Spectre facility was a maze of silent corridors and windowless rooms. Her first instructor was a wiry man with ice-blue eyes and the accent of Northern Europe. He introduced himself only as Anders. I teach you how to move unseen and stay alive, he said without preamble. Hours blurred into a relentless rhythm. Tactical medicine under fire, rapid infiltration drills, silent movement through hostile terrain. They trained her to treat a sucking chest wound while a timer counted down to simulated airstrikes, to shoot and suture in the same breath. Every exercise carried the same unspoken message: heal and fight, fight and heal. By the third week, her body ached in places she'd forgotten existed, but her mind found a strange clarity. She could feel the old instincts fusing with her medic's discipline, a single organism of precision. And yet each night, when she closed her eyes, she still heard the question the helicopter had asked: why? Colonel Steele occasionally observed from a balcony, arms folded. He rarely offered praise, only quiet nods when she surpassed a benchmark others barely met. His presence was both pressure and reassurance, a constant reminder that someone believed she could straddle this impossible line. One evening he joined her on the outdoor range, the sky a sheet of bruised purple. "How are you holding up?" he asked, voice low. Tessa lowered her rifle, breath misting in the cold. "It's different. Different can be good. Or dangerous." He studied her for a long moment. Dangerous isn't always bad, Staff Sergeant. Sometimes it's the only language the world understands. She considered that, the wind sharp against her skin. "I don't want to lose the part of me that heals." "Then don't," Steele said simply. "The point isn't to choose, it's to know when both are necessary." His words lingered long after he left. Weeks became months. Missions for other teams came and went, classified whispers in the hallways. Tessa drilled until muscle memory replaced thought, until she could shift from trauma care to silent overwatch without a heartbeat of hesitation. Then, one rain-slick night, Steele summoned her to the operations center. The The room hummed with urgency. A map glowed red over a stretch of coastline, coordinates she recognized from the file in her first folder. Recon team compromised, an analyst reported. 4 operators pinned in a fishing village, hostile militia converging, no local support. Steele turned to Tessa. We need an immediate med extraction. Our team can't move without advanced care. You're the only Spectre medic within range. When? She asked. Now. A surge of adrenaline pulsed through her, familiar, unwelcome, alive. Within minutes she was geared up, lightweight armor, suppressed carbine, full trauma kit. The transport plane roared to life, rain hammering its fuselage. Steele clasped her shoulder before she boarded. Remember, he said, eyes steady, save lives first, but if someone tries to stop you. I know, she finished, the echo of the ridge heavy in her chest. I know. The ramp lifted, sealing her in darkness broken only by red cabin lights. Engines screamed, the plane hurtled forward, and the world outside disappeared. Have you ever felt the instant when destiny stops asking and simply arrives? Tessa gripped the straps of her seat, heartbeat sinking with the thrum of the engines. Ahead lay an unnamed coastline, a trapped team, and the thin line between healer and warrior that she now carried like a second skin. Somewhere beyond the rain and clouds, the next chapter waited. Why did the rain sound like a warning? Each drop hammered against the fuselage of the transport plane, a relentless drumming that made the cabin feel smaller, the air heavier. Red lights cast long shadows across the strapped-in figures of the strike team. Tessa sat among them, gear pressing into her shoulders, the weight of her trauma kit digging into her thigh. No one spoke. In silence, soldiers carry their own ghosts. She kept her eyes closed, not to sleep but to center. She remembered the ridge at Viper, the steady breath that carried her through chaos. She remembered Steele's words before boarding, save lives first. But if someone tries to stop you, the thought sat in her chest like a stone. The pilot's voice broke the tension. 20 minutes out. Weather's ugly. Expect rough approach. The engines shifted pitch, a low growl under the rain's hiss. Across from her, a young operator with sergeant's stripes adjusted the sling of his carbine, then glanced at her. Curiosity flickered in his eyes. Maybe he'd heard the rumors too, the medic who fought like a ghost. He nodded once. Respect, silent and simple. She returned it, nothing more. The drop zone was a stretch of coastline littered with jagged rock, surf smashing itself into froth. The team fast-roped from the hovering aircraft, boots sinking into sand churned by storm tide. Tessa landed last, knees bending into the impact, her pack pulling her backward before she steadied herself. Spectre 1, Spectre 2 on me, the team leader barked into comms. His voice was calm, controlled, the kind that held panic at bay. Brooks, stay center, we move fast. They slipped through the rain-slicked darkness, shapes among shadows, their gear muted to silence. Tessa followed their rhythm, her breath sinking with the crash of waves. Ahead, the faint glow of a fishing village blinked against the storm. Roofs sagged under years of neglect, alleys twisted like scars. The militia had turned it into a fortress, and somewhere inside, 4 operators were bleeding out. The first contact came fast. A sentry stepped into their path, cigarette glowing in the dark. The suppressed pop of a rifle ended him before his lungs finished their inhale. His body slumped into the mud, soundless. Tessa kept moving, heart steady. She hated how normal it felt to step past him. They reached the village edge, mud huts and rusted shacks leaning against each other like tired men. Gunfire cracked somewhere deeper inside, muffled by the storm. The team leader raised a fist, halt. Voices carried, harsh and urgent. Militia patrol, 6 men. Tessa crouched low, the stench of fish and diesel thick in her nose. She could hear the patrol's boots splashing closer. Her fingers brushed the grip of her sidearm almost by instinct. She wasn't supposed to fight unless necessary. But what counted as necessary in the dark? The operators moved like shadows, cutting down the patrol before the men realized they weren't alone. 6 bodies lay in the mud. The rain washed their blood into thin rivers. Tessa's chest tightened. Not pity, not judgment, just the reminder that every choice here was final. "Move," the leader whispered. The building where the trapped operators had holed up was a sagging structure near the village square. Windows shattered, smoke curling out. A firefight raged inside, sporadic bursts, desperate. The team stacked against the wall, weapons ready. Tessa's world narrowed. She wasn't here to fight. She was here to save whoever was still alive. She centered her breath, forcing her body into the calm she'd practiced. Flashbang entry. The room exploded in light and sound. Tessa moved in behind the strike team, her boots slipping on slick tile. The air was thick with cordite and plaster dust. 3 men crouched behind an overturned table, blood dark on their uniforms. One clutched his abdomen, another his shoulder. The third was pale, unmoving, chest rising shallow. A fourth lay across the floor, leg twisted unnaturally, eyes wide but alive. "Medic," one gasped, relief breaking through pain. Tessa was already on her knees, trauma kit open, gloves snapped. She blocked out everything except the wounded in front of her. The roar of gunfire outside became background noise like rain on glass. "Pressure here," she told one operator, guiding his trembling hands over his own wound. She turned to the man with the abdominal bleed, assessing in a glance deep but survivable if controlled. Tourniquet on the leg of the fourth. IV started. Morphine dosed. Her hands moved fast, precise, the rhythm of muscle memory. "Brooks," the team leader called, crouched near the door. "We've got to move. Reinforcements inbound." She didn't look up. 2 minutes. He didn't argue. He knew what she could do in 2 minutes. Bullets smashed through the thin walls. Splinters rained over her shoulders. She pressed harder on the abdominal wound, her own breath slowing. "Stay with me," she whispered to the soldier, voice calm, grounding. "I've got you." His eyes flickered, then steadied on hers, clinging to the certainty she projected. 1 minute, 45 seconds later, she had 3 men stabilized enough to move and the fourth sedated, legs secured. She nodded to the leader. "Ready." Extraction was chaos pressed into silence. They moved through alleys slick with mud, burdened with the wounded. Tessa carried one man's weight across her shoulders, every step a promise. Shadows flickered at the edge of her vision, militia reinforcements, too many, too close. The first shots cracked behind them. The strike team returned fire, controlled bursts snapping through the rain. Tessa pressed forward, heart hammering. Ahead, the coastline loomed, dark and unforgiving. A hostile broke from cover, sprinting toward them with weapon raised. Tessa's instincts surged before thought. She dropped to one knee, carbine braced, sight lined. One breath, one squeeze. The man fell, sliding lifeless into the mud. She didn't stop to process. She moved. The wounded needed her alive. By the time they reached the extraction point, the storm had swallowed the gunfire. The evac helicopter's blades churned the air, whipping rain sideways. The team loaded the casualties in controlled urgency, Tessa guiding every movement to avoid tearing sutures, avoiding panic. As the bird lifted, the village shrank to a smear of light swallowed by storm. Tessa sat wedged between stretchers, one hand steadying an IV, the other pressed to a bandaged chest. The men looked at her with something rawer than gratitude, trust, absolute and unshakable. She met their eyes briefly, then looked away. Trust felt heavier than the rifle slung across her back. Back at Raven, the wounded disappeared into surgery bays. Tessa stayed long enough to deliver her notes, her hands still trembling faintly from the come-down of adrenaline. She walked alone to her quarters, rain still dripping from her gear. She sat on the bunk, staring at the wall. She had saved 4 men who might not have survived without her. She had also ended another life without hesitation. Which part weighed more? She pulled out her notebook, the one she had carried since Viper. Her pen hovered, then scratched across the page. I saved them, all four, that has to matter. But tonight I didn't hesitate when I pulled the trigger. It wasn't defense. It wasn't accident, it was necessity. Is that how it starts? Not hesitation, just instinct. She stopped, pressing the pen to the page until the ink bled. Her breathing slowed, her eyes closing. The storm outside battered the walls, as if the world itself wanted answers she couldn't give. 2 days later, Colonel Steele called her into his office. Maps covered the walls, red pins clustered like old wounds. He gestured for her to sit. "You did well," he said simply. "The team owes you their lives." Tessa folded her hands in her lap. "I did what I had to." Steele studied her, his gaze calm but unflinching. "How did it feel?" She hesitated. Saving them, it felt right. Pulling the trigger, she shook her head. It felt automatic. "Automatic isn't bad," Steele said. "It means your training held. What matters is why you chose." "Did I choose?" she asked, voice low. "Or did instinct decide for me?" He leaned forward. "Sometimes instinct is the purest form of choice. You didn't kill for vengeance. You killed because without it those men wouldn't be alive. That's the balance you walk now." She looked away, the words sitting heavy but true. Steele let the silence breathe, then added softly, "You're not just a medic anymore, Brooks. You're what comes after, a guardian. That's rarer than skill. That's trust." That night she sat outside under a sky washed clean of storm. Stars glimmered like fragments of something broken and beautiful. She held the worn photograph in her hands, the girl with the rifle, the past she thought she'd buried. "You're still here," she whispered to the photo, "but I'm not you anymore." Maybe she wasn't just the girl with the rifle. Maybe she wasn't just the medic either. Maybe she was becoming something that held both, something unnamed. The night air pressed cool against her skin, and for the first time she didn't fight the question. She let it sit, patient as the stars. Why did the desert smell like memory? The air over the plateau tasted of copper and dry stone, a scent that reached back to childhood ranges and forgotten mornings. Tessa crouched behind a crumbling wall, night vision lenses bathing the world in a ghostly green. A pale moon carved the jagged hills into black silhouettes. Somewhere below, an entire village held its breath, civilians, militia, and one man whose capture could decide whether the region bled for another decade. Operation Grey Lantern. Objective: secure an insurgent financier alive. Complication: civilians embedded in the target zone. Her role: primary medic in silent overwatch. Colonel Steele's voice whispered through the comms. "Spectre team, confirm positions." The replies came like echoes. 2 ready, 3 ready. Tessa flexed her fingers around the suppressed carbine. 4 in place, she said quietly. Her own voice surprised her, calm, steady, almost detached. This was her third mission since the coastal rescue. Each had blurred the line between healer and hunter a little more. She told herself she was here to save lives, to keep her team breathing. But every time her finger brushed a trigger, a part of her wondered if she was slowly becoming the version of herself she once swore to leave behind. Below, the target house glowed faintly under moonlight. Children slept behind thin wooden walls. The financier, a man who moved weapons and whispers across borders, was reported to be inside, guarded by half a dozen armed fighters. A single gunshot in the wrong direction would turn the mission into tragedy. "Spectre 4, the team leader murmured. "Eyes on civilians." Tessa adjusted her scope. 3 children, 1 woman, northeast corner, clear line to exit. "Copy, we go silent, no collateral." The team ghosted forward, boots kissing sand with surgical precision. Tessa moved in their shadow, every sense stretched taut. The night pulsed with quiet danger. She could feel the question rising. When does protection require a single perfect shot? They breached without sound, door splintered, whispers of suppressed fire. Tessa slipped inside after them, carbine angled low. The air smelled of sweat and fear. She found the children first, huddled wide-eyed but unharmed, ushered quickly toward the exit. The mother clutched them, trembling. Then a shout shattered the silence. A guard burst from a back room, rifle swinging toward the cluster of civilians. Time slowed. Tessa's training moved faster than thought. She stepped between the muzzle and the children, sight picture locked, breath flat. One squeeze. The man fell before the echo reached the walls. The children didn't scream, they only stared, frozen. Tessa lowered the weapon, heart hammering. She wanted to say I'm sorry, but words felt useless. Instead, she guided them out, voice soft, steady. This way, you're safe now. The financier surrendered without a fight, wrists bound, eyes cold. Extraction was clean, surgical. By dawn, the Spectre team was airborne, leaving the village behind like a fatting dream. Back at Raven, the debrief was clinical. Mission success. 0 friendly casualties. High-value targets secured. Collateral none. Except, Tessa thought, for the weight of a single life taken in the dark. Later, in the quiet of her quarters, she washed the sand from her hands and opened her notebook. The words came slow, deliberate. One shot. One man. Children behind me. I didn't hesitate. I don't regret saving them, but I wonder what each shot carves away. Is mercy measured only in lives preserved, or also in the parts of yourself you give up to protect them? She closed the book, listening to the low hum of the bass. Outside, the desert wind carried no answers. Weeks passed in a blur of training, intel briefings, and covert insertions. Missions bled into one another, extracting a wounded operative from a collapsed tunnel network, delivering field surgery under enemy mortar fire, guiding refugees through a mined canyon. Each operation sharpened her skills until the line between combatant and caregiver was no line at all. Her team trusted her completely now. They moved with an unspoken rhythm, one organism of shadow and purpose. They called her Doc, but the word had changed. It carried a new respect, a quiet acknowledgement that she was more than a medic. She was their shield. Yet inside, Tessa felt the tension grow. Nights stretched long with half-dreams of faces she'd shot, voices she'd never know. She would wake before dawn and run the perimeter until the cold air burned her lungs, as if she could outrun the questions. Colonel Steele noticed. One evening he found her on the training range, the desert sky bleeding into twilight. She was lining up targets with mechanical precision, each shot a whisper of suppressed thunder. "You're restless," he said, stepping beside her. "I'm awake," she replied, lowering the rifle. "That's not the same thing." She looked out across the empty sand. "How many missions before I can't tell if I'm saving lives or just taking them?" Steele studied her, eyes unreadable. "The difference isn't in the count, it's in the why. And if the why gets complicated, then you remember who you are," he said quietly. "You hold to it even when the world tries to blur it." Tessa absorbed his words, the desert wind cool against her face. Maybe he believed it. Maybe she still did. The next call came before dawn. An Allied convoy had been ambushed in a mountain pass 2 countries away, multiple wounded, hostile forces still in the area. Spectre was tasked with extraction and medical stabilization. The flight was long and silent. Tessa sat across from Anders, the taciturn instructor who had become a teammate. He offered her a rare half-smile. "You always look calm," he said over the engine noise. "Calm as practice," she replied. "Practice is truth," he said, and that was all. They landed on a narrow plateau choked with fog. The air smelled of pine and cordite. The ambush site lay in a ravine below, lit by sporadic tracer fire. Tessa descended with the team, boots slick on wet stone. Wounded soldiers lay scattered amid wrecked vehicles. Smoke curled from a burning truck, orange against the gray. Tessa dropped to her knees beside the nearest casualty, a young corporal bleeding heavily from a chest wound. Her hands worked before thought. Seal, decompress, IV. Around her, the team exchanged bursts of fire with unseen attackers. A shot rang out close, too close. She felt the snap of air as a bullet passed near her shoulder. Instinct turned her head, a figure on the ridge, rifle aimed straight at her patient. There was no time to call it out. Her own carbine came up, sights finding center. Breath, squeeze. The figure toppled, rifle clattering down the rocks. The corporal lived. Hours later, as dawn bled across the peaks, the survivors were loaded for evacuation. Tessa sat against a boulder, exhaustion settling into her bones. Anders approached, eyes steady. "You saved him," he said. She nodded, staring at the ridge where the shooter had fallen. "And I killed someone else." Anders tilted his head. "Because you had to." "Does it ever stop weighing on you?" she asked. "No," he said after a long pause. "But neither does the worth of the lives you saved." He left her with that. She watched the sunrise creep over the mountains, the world painted in quiet gold, and tried to believe it. Back at Raven, Steele debriefed them with his usual measured calm. "Outstanding work," he concluded, eyes lingering on Tessa. "You continue to prove that healing and defense are not opposites. They are the same mission." After the briefing, he caught her alone. "You held the line again," he said softly. Tessa met his gaze and crossed it. Steele's expression held something like respect. Sometimes the line only exists so someone like you can decide when it must be crossed. His words stayed with her long into the night. In her quarters, she opened her notebook once more. "Today a young man breathes because I acted without hesitation. Another man will never wake because of the same act. I keep telling myself the scale balances, but scales break. Maybe the measure isn't balance at all. Maybe it's the courage to choose when the world gives you nothing but impossible choices." She set down the pen, the silence of the desert pressing in like a held breath. Somewhere beyond these walls, another mission waited, another choice she would have to make. She lay back on the bunk, eyes on the ceiling, and let the question settle again. Who was she becoming? And would she recognize herself when the missions finally ended? Why did the night feel like it was waiting for her? The wind off the inland sea moved with a strange patience, whispering across the dunes as if it already knew the ending. Tessa stood at the edge of the forward staging zone, helmet cradled under one arm, eyes on the horizon where a sliver of moon silvered the water. Spectre's next mission was unlike any before. Deep insertion into a contested port city where a shadow coalition planned to trade a chemical payload capable of poisoning an entire region. The order was simple on paper: stop the exchange, secure the weapon, prevent mass casualties. But intelligence carried a name she hadn't heard in years. The broker coordinating the sale, Elias Corin. A name she had buried with her old life. The man who had trained her to shoot before she could legally drive. The man who'd whispered the first lesson she ever learned about violence: control the moment or it controls you. Her fingers tightened around the helmet. Why him, why now? Briefing room, 2300 hours. Colonel Steele traced a line across a holographic map glowing in cold blue. Primary objective: intercept the chemical canisters before transfer. Secondary: capture Corin alive if possible. He glanced at Tessa, his expression unreadable. Intel suggests he commands private security, former special forces, heavily armed. We insert silent, exfil fast. Tessa forced her voice steady. Any civilian density. High dockside markets, that's the complication. She nodded once, hiding the churn in her chest. Her past and present were on a collision course. She couldn't tell them, not yet. After the meeting, Steele lingered. Something on your mind? Always is, she said, keeping her eyes on the map. He studied her for a long moment. Remember, the objective is prevention. We're not hunting for revenge. Don't let anything cloud that. His words landed like a quiet challenge. Does he know? She wondered. But his gaze held only trust, and that almost hurt more. Insertion came 2 nights later beneath a sky bruised purple by distant city lights. Spectre moved through the labyrinthine docks like smoke, weaving past cargo cranes and stacks of rusting containers. The air smelled of brine and diesel, slick with mist. Tessa's senses sharpened with each step. Every creak of steel, every flap of tarp sounded too loud. Ahead, voices murmured in a language she half remembered from old missions, Corin's language. The team halted behind a wall of containers. From her perch, Tessa peered through a thermal scope. 6 guards, disciplined, patterns tight. Beyond them, the faint glint of canisters inside a covered truck. And standing near the rear hatch, giving orders with a precise tilt of his head, Elias Corin. 8 years melted away. She saw him as he'd been when she was 16, a shadowed figure on a firing range at dawn, his voice soft but absolute. Breathe with the rifle, become the moment. Her pulse quickened, not with fear but with the ache of recognition. He was older now, hair streaked with gray, but the stance was the same, calm, calculated. Spectre 4, the team leader whispered. Target in sight, you good? Good, she answered, though the word scraped her throat. The assault unfolded in silence. Suppressed rifles hissed like snakes. Guards dropped before alarm could spread. Tessa moved with the team, carbine steady, heart a metronome. Then chaos bloomed. A guard stumbled into the open and shouted, breaking the quiet. Gunfire erupted, short, sharp bursts. Tessa slid behind a container, scanning for civilian movement. A scream pierced the air. A dock worker bolted across the alley, terrified. Corin vanished into the smoke. 4 flank left, the leader ordered. Tessa sprinted, boots hammering steel grating. The smell of ozone and salt thickened. She caught sight of him near a warehouse door, a brief flash of the man who had shaped her earliest instincts. He looked back and their eyes locked across the chaos. Recognition flared. He didn't raise his weapon. He simply stared, almost proud. She froze, breath trapped. Control the moment, his voice from years ago. Her sights settled on his chest. One pull and it would be over, chemical threat ended, mission complete. But her finger wouldn't move. Behind her, another guard lunged from the shadows, rifle aimed at her back. Instinct screamed. She pivoted, fired. The man fell. When she turned back, Corin was gone, swallowed by the maze of containers. The team secured the canisters and began exfiltration. Objective achieved, high-value target escaped. Steele would call it a partial success. For Tessa, it felt like a fracture she couldn't name. Back at Raven, the debrief was brisk. Payload secured, 0 civilian casualties. Target escaped, Steele summarized. His eyes flicked to Tessa, questioning but not accusing. We'll get another chance. She kept her expression neutral, understood. But inside, a storm gathered. That night she couldn't sit still. She paced the perimeter under a moon that refused to hide. The encounter replayed in relentless loops, Corin's eyes knowing, almost gentle. The ghost of a mentor who had shaped the skills she'd used to save and to kill. She found herself at the shooting range, the smell of gun oil and sandpapering memory. She loaded a magazine, raised the rifle, and let muscle memory take over. Each shot split the night with a suppressed hiss. Perfect groups on the target, center mass. The old precision returned like it had never left. Why didn't you take the shot? Because he wasn't just a target. Because once, he had been the voice that taught her discipline before she chose compassion. Because some debts can't be paid in blood. She lowered the rifle, chest tight. Steele approached quietly, hands behind his back. Couldn't sleep. Something like that. He studied the tight clusters on the target. You had eyes on Corin, didn't you? Tessa's jaw tightened. Yes. And you let him go. It wasn't a question. She turned to face him, ready for reprimand, but his gaze held only calm curiosity. He trained me, she admitted, years ago before the Corps. Steele absorbed this without flinch. Why didn't you take the shot? Because, she searched for words. Because I'm not sure killing him would have ended anything, and because once he believed in a part of me I'm still trying to protect. Steele nodded slowly. Sometimes restraint is the hardest decision. You kept the city safe. That matters. Does it? She asked, voice low. Yes, he said firmly, because you chose, and choice is what keeps you human. The weight of his certainty steadied something inside her. Weeks passed, missions continued, but the night at the dock stayed with her like a splinter. She wrote in her notebook often, lines of thought she could barely articulate. I faced the man who made me dangerous and let him walk away. Maybe that's weakness. Maybe it's strength. Maybe it's both. But I know this. The part of me that heals is stronger when I remember who taught me control, even if he's the reason I carry a rifle at all. Some nights she wondered if Corin would seek her out. Some nights she almost hoped he would, so the question could find an answer. But for now, she carried on healer and protector, medic and marksman, walking the narrow bridge between mercy and necessity, knowing the next mission would test that balance again. Why did the desert dawn feel like a held breath? The horizon glowed faintly, sand turned silver under the first hint of light. Tessa stood alone on the perimeter wall of Spectre's forward sight, the cold stone beneath her palms slick with dew. The world seemed poised, waiting, like the quiet before a storm she couldn't yet see. It had been 3 weeks since the docks, 3 weeks since Elia's Corin looked into her eyes and vanished into smoke. 3 weeks of restless nights and missions that felt mechanical. She stitched wounds, carried stretchers, offered calm words that steadied men on the brink, but her mind kept looping back to that single unfinished moment. Control the moment, or it controls you. His voice still echoed, as if he'd never left. Colonel Steele found her before sunrise. He approached without preamble, boots whispering over gravel. New intel, he said, handing her a tablet that glowed pale in the gray light. Intercepted comms place Corin in the Kyra Highlands. Remote compound. High probability of chemical stockpiles. Tessa's breath caught before she could stop it. You want him alive. If possible, Steele replied. But the priority is the weapon. If he's there, we end the threat. His eyes searched hers. Can you face him? She looked out over the endless sand, heart steady but heavy. I don't know, she admitted. Steele's voice softened. Then decide now. I won't force you onto this op. Silence stretched. The wind carried a faint chill. I'm in, she said finally. Good, he answered, not as approval but as understanding. We move tonight. Night fell like ink over the highlands. The Spectre team inserted by silent hello, rotors cutting through cold mountain air. Tessa felt the altitude bite at her lungs as they hiked toward the compound, a warren of stone buildings clinging to a cliffside, lantern light flickering in narrow windows. The moon was a thin, sharp crescent. Spectre 2, perimeter east, the leader whispered through comms. 3 north, 4 you're with me. Tessa's heartbeat steadied into mission cadence. Carbine close, medic kit secured, she moved with the shadows. Every crunch of gravel felt amplified against the cliff's silence. They breached a side gate without a sound. Inside, the compound was a labyrinth of stone corridors and echoing chambers. Crates lined the walls, chemical drums sealed with red warning tape. The air held a faint metallic tang that stung the back of her throat. They cleared room after room with clinical precision. Then a door creaked open at the far end of the hall. He stepped out. Elia's Corin. Older, yes, but unmistakable. Gray at the temples, the same measured stance. A sidearm rested loosely in his hand, lowered but not forgotten. His eyes found hers immediately, as if he'd known she was coming. Tessa, he said softly. Not Doc, not Staff Sergeant, just her name. Her breath caught. Behind her, the team leader's rifle trained on him, silent and deadly. You know him, the leader asked sharply. Corin smiled faintly. Better than you think. The corridor seemed to narrow around them. Tessa raised her weapon, every muscle taut. Hands where I can see them." He obeyed slowly, palms open. "Still as steady as the day I trained you," he said. "I wondered when our paths would cross again." "Shut up," she ordered, but her voice betrayed the tremor beneath. He tilted his head calm. "You chose the healer's path. I'm proud of that." "Proud?" The word tasted bitter. "You're selling chemicals that could wipe out thousands." "I sell leverage," he corrected. "Not chaos. Those canisters were never meant to detonate, only to keep larger wars at bay. Balance through fear. You, of all people, should understand the power of restraint." The team leader cut in, voice low and sharp. "We don't need philosophy. Drop the weapon now." Corin set the pistol on the stone floor without breaking eye contact with Tessa. "Tell me, did you hesitate when you saved those children in the village? When you defended the convoy?" "No, because you learned what I taught you. Choice is action." Her grip tightened on the carbine. Memories surged, dawn training sessions, his voice guiding her breath, the precision that had once felt like purpose. "You're no different from me," he said gently. "You just picked a different uniform." The words struck deeper than she wanted to admit. Was he wrong? Steele's voice crackled over comms, calm but urgent. "Spectre 4 status." She keyed her mic, eyes never leaving Corin. "Target secured, alive." A pause. "Copy that. Proceed with extraction." The leader moved forward with zip ties, but Corin spoke again, softer now. "If you hand me over, the people who truly fund this war will replace me by morning. The weapon will move again. You know this." Tessa swallowed hard. She did know. Spectre missions stopped fires but never changed the spark. Yet letting him go would haunt her team, risk countless lives. "Don't let them use you," he whispered. "Not the way they used me. Decide who you are." The hallway vibrated with silence, the choice a weight that seemed to bend the air. She lowered her rifle slightly, not in surrender but in thought. The team leader's eyes widened. "Brooks." "I've got this," she said sharply. She stepped closer until she could see the fine lines at the corners of Corin's eyes, the calm certainty there. "You trained me to control the moment," she said quietly. "This is my moment, not yours." For the first time his expression shifted, something like acceptance. She signaled to the leader, "Restrain him, we take him alive." Zip ties snapped around his wrists. Corin didn't resist. As they moved him toward extraction, he glanced back once. "You chose mercy," he said softly. "Remember what that costs." The flight back was silent except for the chop of rotor blades. Corin sat between two operators, wrists bound, gaze distant. Tessa kept her eyes on the darkness beyond the open door, the cold wind numbing her face. When they landed at Raven, Steele was waiting. He took in the sight of the prisoner with a single nod. "Good work," he said, then looked at Tessa. "How did it feel?" She removed her helmet slowly. "Like holding a line I didn't know I still had." Steele's eyes softened. "That's the hardest kind to hold." Later, in the quiet of her quarters, she opened her notebook again. The words came halting but sure. "I faced the man who taught me everything about precision and control. I didn't kill him. Maybe that's weakness. Maybe it's strength. But I chose. And choice, that's the part of me no one can weaponize." She set the pen down and stared at the ceiling, listening to the night hum through the vents. For the first time in weeks, she felt a strange, steady calm. Not victory, not relief. Something deeper, a fragile peace that came from knowing she could walk between mercy and necessity and still remain herself. Outside, the highland winds shifted, carrying the scent of rain. The mission was over. The war, hers and the world's, would go on. But tonight, Tessa Brooks had answered the question that had followed her across continents. She still belonged to herself. Why did the world seem too still after everything? Morning light spilled across the Spectre compound, soft and unhurried, as if the sky itself refused to remember the night's violence. Tessa stood alone on the roof of the operations building, the cold metal beneath her boots warming by degrees. Below, the base stirred in hushed routines. Distant clatter of gear, the low hum of generators, the faint scent of coffee rising through desert air. The mission was over. Elias Corin, mentor, fugitive, almost myth, sat in a reinforced cell 2 levels below her feet. Interrogators would come. Reports would be written. Decisions would be made in rooms she'd never see. And yet the quiet felt heavier than any firefight she'd survived. She pressed her palms against the railing and let the early light wash over her. I still belong to myself, she thought, and tried to believe it. By midday, the formal debrief unfolded in a secure conference room. Colonel Steele presided, voice as level as ever. Operation High Crest achieved full objective, he stated for the record. Chemical stockpiles neutralized. High-value target in custody. No civilian casualties. He looked around the table, eyes finally resting on Tessa. Staff Sergeant Brooks, your decision to capture rather than kill prevented escalation and allowed us to gather intelligence that's already proving critical. Outstanding work. The praise slid over her like water. I made a choice, she said quietly. That's all. Steele nodded as if he understood the weight behind those words. Choice is everything, he replied. Don't forget that. Later, she walked the narrow hallway to the holding cells. 2 armed guards stepped aside without question. Through the reinforced glass, she saw him, Elias Corin, sitting on the edge of a steel bench, wrists unbound now but posture unchanged. Relaxed, patient. His gray-streaked hair caught the sterile light like silver wire. He looked up as if he'd known she would come. Tessa, he said, the name almost a greeting. She stayed on the far side of the glass. Why did you do it? Her voice was low, steady. Because leverage is louder than bullets, he answered without hesitation. Fear stops wars longer than treaties. You risked children's lives. I saved more than I endangered, he countered. But no explanation will matter to those who only count bodies. She studied him, the calm certainty that had once guided her own aim. You trained me to control the moment. Did you ever wonder what I'd do if the moment was you? A faint smile touched his mouth. Every day, and you chose mercy, that strength most people never find. She exhaled slowly. Mercy isn't weakness. No, he agreed, but it costs. Remember that when the next choice comes. They held each other's gaze for a long, quiet beat, mentor and student, enemies and something more complicated than either word could hold. Then Tessa turned and walked away. She didn't look back. Weeks passed. Missions continued, each one quieter than the last. Spectre neutralized cells, rescued hostages, stabilized wounds in places no map acknowledged. Tessa moved through them with the same disciplined grace, but something inside had shifted. She still healed. She still fought when she had to. But now every decision carried the echo of that night on the docks, of the man who had once shaped her hands and now lived behind reinforced glass because she had chosen restraint. One evening, Colonel Steele joined her on the perimeter, both of them watching the sun bleed out over the dunes. He'll be moved soon, Steele said. International tribunal. Tessa nodded. Will it matter? Steele's jaw tightened. To some, yes. To others, not at all. But your choice gave the world an option besides more blood. That matters whether or not you see it. They stood in companionable silence. The wind off the desert smelled of salt and possibility. Her next leave came unexpectedly. A transport plane ferried her back to a quiet military airfield where mountains met endless sky. She carried only a small pack, medical gear, a notebook, and a single worn photograph. Civilian life moved around her like a language she hadn't spoken in years. Children chasing each other near the terminal fence, the easy laughter of travelers. She walked through it unseen, a shadow wrapped in ordinary clothes. She rented a car and drove toward the hills where she had first learned to breathe with the rifle. The range was long abandoned, just a stretch of wild grass and weathered posts. The air smelled of sage and rain. She sat on a fallen log and unfolded the photograph. Her younger self stared back, eyes fierce, a rifle across her chest, the world still unwritten. She laid the picture on her knee, the wind lifting its corners. "I kept the promise," she whispered, "both of them." In the distance a hawk circled, wings wide against the fading sky. Night came quietly. Stars burned sharp and close, each one a small, cold truth. Tessa wrote by flashlight in her notebook, the pages thick with past missions and reflections. Her pen moved slowly, deliberately. "I have learned that strength isn't choosing between healing and protecting. Strength is knowing when they are the same thing. Sometimes mercy is the most difficult trigger to pull. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts." She closed the book and leaned back, eyes on the vast black canvas above. For years she had believed her life was a choice between two paths, healer or warrior, savior or shadow. But the mountains, the missions, and the man who had once trained her had shown her a different truth. She was both, and she belonged to herself. At dawn she shouldered her small pack and began the walk back toward the airfield, boots crunching softly over the gravel road. The rising sun painted the world in gold and quiet fire. Each step felt light, certain. Somewhere beyond the horizon, missions would continue, conflicts would burn and fade. But Tessa Brooks carried something stronger than orders or skill, the unshakable knowledge that her humanity was her greatest weapon and her greatest gift. Sometimes the healer has to pick up the sword. Sometimes the guardian lays it down. And sometimes the quiet ones change the world without anyone ever knowing their name. The wind rose behind her, carrying the desert's long breath toward the open sky, and Tessa walked on steady, unafraid, wholly her own.